Hello and welcome to our webinar, An Introduction to ESOS. My name is Melanie Blackmore and I'm the Managing Director of Blackmores. At Blackmores, we provide consultancy services in quality, environment and risk management. We have a wide range of clients from many sectors including charities, stadiums, data centres and construction companies, to name but a few. And we've been involved with the implementation and maintenance of energy management systems both in the UK and overseas ever since the first energy management standards were launched in 2009. The purpose of the webinar is to provide an introduction to ESOS, which is the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme. I'll clearly explain what ESOS is and the eligibility criteria. Then, for those that need to comply, I shall provide an overview on the two main routes to compliance: the ESOS audit route and the ISO 50001 certification route. So what is ESOS? Well, ESOS is the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme, which was launched for consultation by DEC, which is the Department of Energy and Climate Change, in July 2013. It's a mandatory energy assessment and energy savings identification scheme for large enterprises. And these large enterprises have to undertake compliance by December 2015. So what is a large enterprise? A large enterprise is defined as having more than 250 employees or an annual turnover exceeding €50 million or an annual balance sheet total exceeding 43 million. And in the UK, the public sector is not required to participate. So how do you qualify? Well, the scheme covers but is not limited to limited companies, public companies, trusts, partnerships, unincorporated associations and non-for-profit bodies. ESOS has not one, but three compliance phases. And we're currently in the first phase, which goes from the 6th of December 2011 through to the 5th of December 2015. Then phase 2 and phase 3 are subsequently in 4-year phases. So the current deadline for this phase is the 5th of December 2015. And there are financial penalties for organisations that have not submitted their evidence pack to the Environment Agency by this date. So why introduce ESOS? Well, apart from it coming from an EU directive and not having much choice in the matter in the UK, it's actually estimated to lead to 1.6 billion net benefits to the UK, with the majority of these savings being felt directly by businesses as a result of energy savings. ESOS energy audits have the potential to increase business profitability and competitiveness through the implementation of energy efficiency measures, which can actually have much wider benefits, such as reducing other costs, for example waste disposal, and increasing employee engagement. So what do you have to do to comply with ESOS? Well, in simple terms, an ESOS assessment requires you just to do three things. Firstly, measure your total energy consumption. Secondly, conduct energy audits to identify cost-effective energy efficiency recommendations. And finally, to submit a report of compliance to the Environment Agency, which is the scheme administrator in the UK. So these ESOS energy audits must use 12 months of energy consumption data, produce cost-effective recommendations for the areas being audited, and be overseen, conducted and reviewed by an ESOS lead assessor. So what types of energy consumption are we looking at, and how are they used within an organisation? Well, just very briefly, the ESOS compliance guidelines look at three main areas. Buildings, for example, is one of them. So we look at heating, and looking at energy saving opportunities associated with this. So, for example, common sense tells you to turn heating down, replace inefficient boilers, etc. But also looking at other things such as ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, so installing daylight sensors potentially, or replacing bulbs with highly efficient LED lighting. Also looking at the fabric of the building and any building controls. So the other areas are industrial processes. So this is all about your way of working as a business. Do you use manufacturing equipment, for example? Do you use refrigeration and motors and drives within your organisation? And how are they being used? Looking at transportation, so fuel consumption. You can look at monitoring driver fuel performance, and also looking at routing and scheduling of your transportation logistics. And finally, maintenance and vehicle improvements. And then, of course, it's important to communicate with your employees about energy saving opportunities, so that they can share in the knowledge of how to reduce energy consumption, and how you can help to meet targets. So, what are the routes to compliance? Well, there are a few options. The two main options that the vast majority of businesses are making the most of are the ESOS energy audits and ISO 50001. There are a couple of others which I will come on to, but these are the two main ones, and these are the areas that we're covering in a lot more detail within this webinar. So firstly, what are the advantages of conducting ESOS energy audits and going down this route? Well, it covers all areas of the organisation: buildings, industrial processes and transportation, for example. And you can draw on existing energy data to help with your compliance. The only disadvantage with it is that it's not actually providing you with a mechanism for implementing those energy controls, sadly. So that's where ISO 50001 comes in. So that's the other option. So ISO 50001 is an all singing, all dancing energy management system, and it can be covered across multiple sites, multiple services, etc. And basically provides you with a framework for continued improvement as far as energy efficiency is concerned. The only disadvantage here is that there is additional effort that needs to be put into developing an energy management system compliant to 50001, and it does go above the minimum ESOS requirements. The other three main routes are the Green Deal assessments, both for domestic and non-domestic buildings, and the display energy certificates. The main advantage here is that they're relatively quick and easy to do. The main disadvantage for all of them is it is only really covering your building, so it's very restrictive. It doesn't cover all aspects of ESOS. So that's why I'm not going to go into detail on these options today. So I'll now evaluate and explain the two main routes in more detail. So let's explore how ESOS audits can be used to conform to ESOS compliance. So within this webinar, in order to get you started, this is the area that we're going to cover. We're going to cover the planning of your ESOS audits, conducting those audits, so looking at competency of assessors and sampling, data collection and analysis, identifying those all-important opportunities for improvement, the documentation that you need to collate, and then finally present to the Environment Agency. So understanding the scope of your ESOS auditing is essential in the planning stage, and to assist in determining where the most value will be gained from the ESOS audits. A useful starting point is to map out which sites are in the scope of ESOS. Then map out the energy consuming activities that are undertaken at each site and by transportation activities. Then, by identifying the percentage of total energy consumption for each site and activity, you can then start to plan where to focus the ESOS audits in order for the organisation to gain the most benefit. So this is an example that we're going to have a quick look at. This is where we've got head office, we've got a warehouse and stores, and what we're looking at is how we're using energy within these different sites. And how is that broken down? So electricity, for example, we're using lighting equipment and air conditioning, for example, and then gas, we've got a boiler there, okay? And what we've done is we've calculated the percentage. Then we've got our pool cars that are using diesel, and then obviously we've got activities taking place within the warehouse and the stores, okay? So that's how we've broken that down, just as to provide you with an example. So ESOS audits can be used as a single route to compliance or to top up alternative routes such as DEC certification, whereby 90% of your total consumption is not being covered. So basically you have got some flexibility to exclude up to 10% of your identified energy consumption under what is called the de minimis rule. Okay. So this can enable you to focus on audits where the greatest gains can be made, and we would also recommend that you consider any quick wins initially, because obviously we've only got about 6 months left now before the deadline. So looking at quick wins where we can potentially maximise on any opportunities for reducing energy consumption. You may want to include more than 90% of the total energy consumption within scope as a safety measure, as you may come across difficulties in obtaining verifiable data, which I'll come on to later on. So that is where you might want to then call in the de minimis report at a later point. But any exclusions that you do need to make must be clearly detailed within the evidence pack, together with the rationale for exclusions. So when developing your audit plan, ascertain whether there is already information available to you. And you may need to speak to staff in different areas of the organisation to identify if energy assessments have already been carried out previously. You need to review any identified information that you've got in place across the organisation, and it should be based on 12 months of energy consumption, which should be dated somewhere between the 6th of December 2011 and the 5th of December 2015. You also need to identify energy saving opportunities based on energy consumption profile of the organisation, which will include the life cycle cost assessment. So I mentioned about verifiable data sources. So what do they look like? Well, if we're looking at electricity, for example, looking at meter readings and schedules. If we're looking at solid fuels, we could look at delivery notes. And for other energy uses such as stored liquid, for example, we could look at stock records and readings. And again, we've got meter readings available to us as well. Okay. And this is what your verifiable data sources could look like, which will not only include the activity type and fuel used, but also the quantity and energy conversion, and then that needs to equate to the total percentage used within the organisation. So how do you go about gathering information? Okay, well obviously it's a key part of this process, and you've got to allow sufficient time to collect the necessary information in advance of your audits, as it may not all be centrally captured or stored. I mean, that would obviously make life really easy, but in reality that doesn't always happen. So this element could actually take several months if detailed records are not available. And where can you go to find this information? Well, you could go to the facilities manager for information, a finance team as well, a travel team, the maintenance team, and managers that might look after the vehicle fleets as well within the organisation. So they're just a few examples. Invariably there will be some information that is missing at some point. So what do you do if you identify gaps in your energy consumption data? Well, you have to make an estimate. So for example, you might estimate electricity usage over a 12-month period in a situation whereby you only have 7 months worth of data. And any extrapolation of data or estimates must be detailed within your evidence pack that you submit to the Environment Agency. And you need to identify how you've come to this conclusion and your final energy consumption calculations. So once you've determined which parts of the company you need to audit and what information is already available, then you can start planning the audits. And again, the audit plan and methodology needs to be included within that evidence pack. So when reviewing your ESOS scope, you might identify that you have a range of similar operations. So you might have a number of offices, a number of similar retail units, and where this is the case, it may not actually be necessary to visit every site. Basically what you do is you select an appropriate sample for the audit. You basically take the site visits and basically propose that to your lead assessor at the audit planning stage, and discuss that with them, because there is actually no ESOS mandatory requirement on what percentage of buildings, processes or transport fleet should be sampled. And the sample selected should be representative of the range of different types of sites, vehicles, etc., and it must be sufficient to provide confidence that the audit findings and recommendations will be complete, relevant and of course accurate. So who do you get to complete these audits and to oversee the auditing process and the submission of your audit report? Well, a registered lead assessor must oversee your ESOS assessment, but individual audits can be carried out by suitably skilled people who are not lead assessors. And the skills and experience of the people who carry out your audits will be a key factor in the value that you get from ESOS. So you just need to allow time, for once the audits have been completed, to submit to your lead assessor. And also you need to allow time for a company director to sign off the reports and to notify the Environment Agency that you've complied by the 5th of December 2015. And don't forget to try and ensure that all parties, such as your internal staff, are fully aware of what's going on within the organisation, as they may need to escort the auditor on site or also help with taking meter readings. So it's important that you take and keep records of any notes, photos and calculations at the time of the audit, because this will need to be submitted in your evidence pack. So moving on to the analysis and identification of opportunities. The purpose of the report is to identify how energy is being used and where your opportunities for energy reductions can be made. And this is based on the analysis of the energy consumption data and the site surveys. So the auditor will be able to then compile a list of cost-effective opportunities. So here are a few considerations for you. So financial savings offered by the improvement measures and the necessary investment required. So it'd be fantastic to be able to quantify exactly what your cost savings will be over a period of time to the board within your organisation, and to be able to quantify that and include that within your report. And also looking at return on investment opportunities. This could be as a result of investing in new equipment or energy efficient products. And you could also include a comparison in terms of both cost and energy consumption, between looking at those alternative energy efficiency improvement measures. And finally, ESOS requires participants to use the life cycle cost analysis where practicable. So once information has been gathered and the surveys have been completed, opportunities identified, they need to be formatted into an accessible report that provides a clear case for implementation. It must summarise the significant opportunities for energy savings, including the scope and boundaries of the audit, the methodology, the sources of the data used, and any significant gaps, and what methods were used to cover the gaps through the estimation methodology. Calculations of energy use, energy savings and cost savings should be included in an appendix to the report. The opportunities should highlight priority measures by means of a prioritised list of energy saving opportunities. So finally, once you've completed all of that, the next stage is to submit that report. Okay, so the ESOS report has to be reviewed and signed off by the ESOS lead assessor and either one or two directors. The business can then register their compliance with the Environment Agency. This notification is made online, and then organisations are starting to do it now. I think it should be noted that it's probably not a good idea to leave it till the final day. Maybe that system could crash potentially. So it's good to get that started as soon as possible, really. And the ESOS audits can be basically carried out by your own qualified personnel, or they can be provided by a consultancy firms such as Blackmores, who have accredited ESOS assessors. Rachel Churchman, who is our ESOS assessor, is actually going to be available for a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. Okay, so that was the ESOS energy audit route to compliance. We're now going to take a look at ISO 50001 and to see how an energy management system can potentially provide a solution to ESOS compliance. If you already have an ISO 50001 energy management system certified by a UCAS approved certification body covering all your energy use, then this will be sufficient to constitute for an ESOS assessment. So you don't really need to do anything else other than register with the Environment Agency and make your declaration of compliance to ISO 50001 and provide your certification. So you need to be certified during the compliance period that we discussed earlier, and the certification must remain valid at the compliance date as well. So that's it, no questions asked. ISO 50001 ticks all the boxes for ESOS, that's fairly straightforward. But for those of you that aren't familiar with ISO 50001, I'm just going to go through a few slides to give you an idea of what an ISO 50001 energy management system is, and also how to implement one if you're interested in going down this route. So ISO 50001 is a best practice framework to help organisations to improve their energy performance and energy efficiency, thus reducing their energy consumption and carbon footprint. And this is the energy management system model from ISO 50001. So starting at the top, we have an energy policy. Now this is typically a one-page statement of intent. Okay, and we've got our energy planning requirements. So this is capturing your energy consumption, and I'm going to be going into this in a little bit more detail about how you can do that energy review. So basically you're identifying how your organisation is using energy. how you capture that information. Then we've got implementation and operation. Okay, so that could be looking at the controls for reducing your energy consumption. So it could be the operation of a CHP plant, that's combined heat power, or having a lamp replacement policy, for example, so that you know that across your organisation, every time you need to replace a light, it's replaced with an LED light. So it's basically about taking those energy saving opportunities and actually putting it into practice. And then of course we need to monitor and measure and analyse the efficiency of the steps that we've taken to implement these controls. And obviously we don't live in a perfect world. There will be non-conformities and room for deviation, so there's methodology in there for dealing with any non-conformities and corrective and preventive action. We also have an internal audit requirement within 50,001. So this is where we're not just looking at ticking boxes, we're looking at the identification of the efficiency of the measures that you've put in place and the management of your energy management system. And in turn that does result in identifying further opportunities for improvement. It questions your way of working and how you can introduce additional controls. And then finally, the management review process helps you to review the performance of the energy management system, looking back at what you've done well, what you haven't done so well, and then helping you to review objectives, policies and procedures so that you're continually improving within your organisation. So what are the business market drivers for ISO 50001? Well, we know that there's a depletion of natural resources and an increase in energy prices as well over the years. So it is a risk to any business being reliant on energy providers, both from an operational point of view and a financial perspective. We've also seen an increase in legislation and regulation associated with energy management. ESOS is a prime example of that, at the European level. And although we've just come out of a recession, we still are under a pressure to reduce our costs and improve bottom line and profitability. And depending on what industry you're in, I think it's pretty much any industry now, there is quite often pressure from stakeholders for you to demonstrate your energy credentials. So looking at some of the benefits of ISO 50001, well, it's a real kind of mechanism to implement those energy saving opportunities and help you to improve your resource efficiency, which in turn can lead to cost reductions. For example, we worked with an NHS trust that had a couple of hospitals and about 100 community buildings. As a result of implementing ISO 50001 a few years ago, they found that they had over £1 million of savings in energy alone. It helps you to recognise what the legal requirements are and again put in systems in place to ensure that you are keeping on top of that legislation and complying with it on an ongoing basis. It helps to satisfy stakeholders by having certification. You can display it on your website and use it in marketing materials. So it can provide an organisation with a competitive advantage, and in some cases, in some industries, it can give you a unique selling point and also enhance your reputation. And finally, one of the main benefits is full ESOS compliance as well, as I mentioned earlier. For those of you that may already be familiar with some ISO standards, there is some commonality across the ISO standard family, so I've just included a few of them here. ISO 9001 being the main one, ISO 14001, which is the environmental standard, and ESOS 18001, the health and safety standard. Now ISO 14001 is more closely aligned with ISO 50001, but you can see from the list of requirements here there is a lot of commonality across the three standards. So what does that mean? Well, if your organisation already has ISO 14001, with a UCAS accredited certification body, that means that you're already halfway there, which is good news. And other organisations may already be partially compliant because they may already have robust energy and environmental policies and procedures in place. And I think it's worth noting that in terms of other standards such as ISO 9001, the quality standard, or 27001, the information security standard, really you'll be about a third of the way there. You'll be about 30% compliant, which is a good start. So for those of you that might be interested in implementing ISO 50001, I've just mapped out a couple of the key stages involved. The first stage is to identify the scope. Okay, so if you're looking at ESOS compliance, obviously it's everything that you do. It's all of your services, all of your offices, warehouses, etc. Okay, but if it's not being done for ESOS compliance, then you can actually restrict the scope in terms of the number of buildings, etc. So once you've identified the scope and you include the physical boundaries, you need to conduct a gap analysis against ISO 50001. So at Blackmores, this is where we'll go into an organisation, look at your energy data, have a walk around, see how energy is being used, the type of equipment, the building, etc. And we'll identify where the strengths are currently in relation to ISO 50001 and where the weaknesses are. And as a result of that, we'll provide an action plan with what you need to do next. Okay. And so basically out of that, we can develop your implementation plan. We identify resources required, both personnel from your organisation, using a third party such as Blackmores, or any equipment that you might need as well. It's usually just time though, really, time and effort that's required. We can help to facilitate an energy working group. This works really well, so we're looking at pulling together representatives from across the organisation, which could include somebody from facilities, somebody from finance, purchasing, transportation, logistics, etc. Because they will know where the waste is and they will know how energy has been consumed, and it's a good opportunity to brainstorm how the organisation uses energy, and on that basis we can then help to quantify that and get that verifiable energy data that we discussed earlier. The energy review is really the catalyst of ISO 50001. So this is where we're looking in more detail at past and present energy uses and looking at different variables, which could include the weather outside, the operations, so whether you have busy periods, for example, within your factory, and the performance as well of energy management. We review all of that, we analyse the data, how it's been used, and convert that so that we can estimate, in terms of CO2 emissions, etc. And from that we can then deduce very clearly what your opportunities for energy savings are. So the output of that is to provide an energy baseline, energy performance indicators, objectives, targets and action plans. So it's basically taking all those energy saving opportunities that we discussed earlier for ESOS compliance and actually doing something about it. Okay, because ESOS audits and ESOS compliance doesn't actually mandate that you have to implement those energy saving controls, unfortunately. But that's the difference between ISO 50001. It provides you with a toolkit to implement all of those initiatives that you've identified. Okay, so as a result of that energy review, we can then look at documenting any energy controls and procedures and policies that we may need to make it all happen. We also need to look at the applicable energy legislation as well within the organisation, and to document those targets and programmes. So that energy management system could be on a server, it could be a hard copy manual, it could be on a wiki, on an intranet. It's entirely up to you. The main elements are basically your energy management system manual, any supporting appendices, so they could be your energy performance indicators, for example, that will change from time to time, your operating procedures and flow charts, any forms and documents, templates that you might use, which could be your energy audit template, for example. And then finally, it's a central repository to keep all of your records as well. So these are the completed energy audit reports, for example, that you need to look after. Okay. So there isn't much point in creating this wonderful energy management system if you're not going to communicate it to anybody. So communication is critical to the success of the implementation of ISO 50001. And you can communicate it in a number of different ways. You can create training materials for all employees, or break it down by operatives and management. You can provide training such as e-learning or classroom-based training. And basically what you then do is you keep records of that training attendance, so you can show that to an assessor when they come in. So you can demonstrate that all employees within the company have been made aware of the energy management system. So other communication methods could include an email from the CEO and regular updates, include information within a company newsletter, have a webinar like this, for example, or e-learning, which is another thing that Blackmores does. And by the way, we've got an ESOS e-learning course coming out on the 6th of July. If you're interested in that, please send us an email at the end of this webinar, and my details will be on a slide at the end. Providing information via display screens, which could be in a reception area, for example, or having posters and notices in a common work area, or a breakout area where people go for lunch, or putting it right in front of employees' faces on PC screensavers so they can't miss it. Okay, so you've communicated your energy management system, and the final stage really is to ensure that you're actually complying with the energy management system. So how do we do that? Well, we plan and conduct internal audits against all areas of the energy management system, and we have interviews with employees. We can capture information in a number of different ways, such as observation, looking at the results of monitoring and measurement and reports that you're producing. And finally, that information is then fed through to the management review meeting, which is where we review the inputs of your energy management system and the outputs, looking at the next steps. Okay, so that could include, for example, results of the energy audits, any changes in legislation and compliance, and monitoring and measuring activities, and then looking at potential changes and setting of new objectives and policies. And the final stage is the assessment, and this is done in 2 stages. Stage 1 is typically a document review, where an assessor will come on site and ask to see your documentation, and of course you'll present that to them, and that's it. And then the stage 2 assessment is where they'll come back. It could be a few weeks, it could be up to a couple of months later, whenever you're ready, and that's when they will look at what you're doing in a lot more detail, and they'll expect to see evidence of conformity to what you say that you do. So if you say that you replace all of your lights with LED, they'll expect to see it. Okay? Or if you say that you monitor and measure your energy consumption, they'll expect to see the records of that. Okay? And finally, once you're certified, don't forget to celebrate your success. Inform all of your stakeholders, both internal and external, on achieving certification to ISO 50001. And then, of course, you're then in a position to inform the Environment Agency towards the end of the year that you're fully compliant as well to the ESOS requirements. Okay, so that concludes the webinar for now. I'd just like to thank you very much for attending today and listening to this presentation. Hopefully that's given you an overview of the options for ESOS compliance, both the ESOS energy audits and the ISO 50001 certification route. But it doesn't end here. We've just got another 5 or 10 minutes of Rachel Churchman's time, who's kindly offered to answer a few questions that frequently come up in association with ESOS. So I'd just like to welcome Rachel Churchman from Blackmores, our accredited ESOS assessor.
Hi Mel, thanks for inviting me.
Great, thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Okay, so we've had a few questions come through on the webinar.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, lovely. Yeah, so just have a look at those then. So, right, okay, that would be an interesting one. What happens if I don't comply by the 5th of December?
Okay, well, obviously the Environment Agency as a regulator, do have the authority to apply civil penalties against any companies that are mandated under ESOS that haven't demonstrated compliance, or they've been found to be non-compliant with their ESOS submission. And actually the penalties are quite severe. Failure to comply with ESOS, so if you're completely ignoring the requirement, will result in fines of up to £50,000. And thereafter there is actually the potential for additional charges of £500 a day, and that's for up to 80 days. So in total you could actually be looking at a fine of £90,000.
Okay.
But it doesn't end there. In addition to that, non-compliant companies will also be named and shamed. So it's not just the financial penalties,
it's reputational
it's
damage,
the intangibles, reputation.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, it's probably cheaper to make every effort to comply to ESOS.
Okay, well thank you for that. Another one is, we've left it quite late to start thinking about ESOS. What can we start to do now?
Okay, right, okay. Well, hopefully everyone's now got an appreciation after listening to the webinar of what's involved in ESOS. So start now if you can. It really is in your interests to start collating the relevant data, the energy usage data, but also do think about how you're going to comply. You've left it very late for 50,001 now. Probably, you're getting to the outside thresholds.
Yeah, because I think a lot of businesses didn't realise that there was actually 4 years to do this, and it's only really in the last year that everybody started to kind of sit up and take notice.
Yeah, they've been really pushing it for about the last year in the media, but it's now getting to sort of the crunch time. The ESOS lead assessors, there's more and more are being trained, but there still currently isn't enough for the anticipated demand. So I would certainly say, source your lead assessor and book some time now for your ESOS assessment. That's probably where you're going to struggle the most. I mean, you can control gathering the data, but you do need that ESOS lead assessor to sign everything off, and their availability is quite scarce.
Okay, great. I've got another one. We are a global organisation. Does ESOS only apply to the UK organisation?
Well, yes, ESOS is the UK's approach to implementing the EU Energy Efficiency Directive. So it does only apply to the UK operations for global groups, so those that are established with Companies House as UK establishments. However, it is an EU directive, therefore other countries will have their own interpretation of ESOS, and they will have their own requirements. So Blackmores are actually already working with some international clients to assist them to meet the ESOS equivalent in their countries. So in answer to the question, yes for the UK, but it's not only the UK that are required to do this.
Okay, great, thank you. And how does ESOS affect franchisees?
Okay, so a franchise will only actually fall under ESOS if the franchise in its own right meets the criteria. there isn't any requirement for a franchisor to aggregate all its franchisees' activities for ESOS reporting. That said, if in a group there are a number of franchises and that want to aggregate and submit together, then as long as they've got that agreement in place, they can do that. But there is no requirement for the franchisor to do that for them.
Okay, great. And I guess if an organisation was unsure about whether they met the eligibility criteria, what would they need to do you think?
Okay, so there are going to be some cases where organisations may have only just met the threshold from an employee size point of view or from a financial point of view. So what they need to do is go back and find, ESOS uses accounting periods, so you need to go back to your past 2 accounting periods and find where you can find 2 accounting periods that are consistent. So either where you've consistently met the requirements, the threshold requirements for two periods, or similarly you may not have met the threshold requirements for 2 periods. And if you fluctuate quite a lot, you do need to go back as far as you can to find 2 accounting periods where you have either met or not met the threshold, and that will be your benchmark for compliance.
Okay. And does ESOS affect only large organisations?
Not always. It depends if you're part of a larger group. So if you're part of a larger group, there may be one of the group members in the UK that does meet the requirements, the thresholds for ESOS. And in those cases, actually then the whole group, or the UK instances of that group, are then subject to ESOS. So that can either be in sort of in one ESOS assessment, or you might decide with written agreement to separate and submit separately. So there are instances where you might think, actually, well, we've only got 50 employees, we don't comply, but if part of your group operates in the UK and does meet the requirements, then unfortunately that then brings you into the scope for ESOS.
Okay. And then finally, I'm a qualified ISO 14001 internal auditor. Can I conduct the audits myself, or do I need certain qualifications?
Okay, so the ESOS audits, the requirement is for them to be signed off by a lead assessor. So there is a requirement for that role within the ESOS compliance. They must be listed on an Environment Agency approved register for energy professionals. In-house members of your team can carry out the audits provided they have the right qualifications. So they will need to have some awareness of energy and energy efficiency, how buildings, how industrial processes work, and how energy efficiency improvements can be made. So there is sort of some competence and experience required if you were going to use an in-house member. But you would still need to get the ESOS assessment signed off by the lead assessor. You can also train people internally to become lead assessors, but that does take an amount of time. It's not something that you could complete in a month or so. You know, it would take more time. So given the sort of deadline date, again, it's leaving it a bit late.
Brilliant. Okay. I think actually I've got just time for one more quick question. Do I have to act on recommendations that come from the audit?
Unfortunately, no. It's not actually mandatory. It's a bit like DEC. It's a bit like the DEC certificate situation where you're given all these wonderful recommendations to save money, but there's no mandatory requirement for you to actually do anything. However, it is in your interests to implement the recommendations that have been made, because ultimately it's an energy savings opportunities scheme.
And who doesn't want to save money?
Exactly. So
energy.
Hopefully by implementing the recommendations, you're going to sort of offset any costs incurred for the process for going through ESOS.
Brilliant. Okay. Excellent. Well, that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to those that have joined us in our webinar today. I hope that you found the webinar informative, and but please feel free to contact us if you'd like a no obligation meeting or a proposal, and we'd be more than happy to assist. And finally, I think I mentioned earlier about the ESOS e-learning course. I believe that that's going to be available on the 6th of July on our website. So again, just send us an email if that's something that interests you. So best of luck with your ESOS compliance, and thank you very much for joining us once again, and goodbye.